At 2:30 this morning, a sniper positioned in Channel 7 studios in Martin Place made a brief report over the radio. He said, "Hostage down, window 2. 8 seconds later, tactical response police stormed the building they'd surrounded since early Monday morning. The building erupted in flashes and bangs, a combination of gunfire and police stun grenades. An exchange of gunfire lasted just 50 seconds, and it was all over. 3 people had died. One was the gunman, who we now know as Manharod Moniz. The 2 others were 38-year-old Katrina Dawson, a 38-year-old mother of 3, a barrister described as one of the state's best and brightest. The other was Tory Johnson, the Lindt café manager. He was 34 and had worked at the café for more than 2 years. Anne Sanders is in Martin Place, where floral tributes are building up at a makeshift shrine. And Anne, this really has become the epicentre of our forum.
This could have been prevented. It could have easily been prevented. I wrote a 166-page book on September 11th, analysis of September 11th, Afghanistan and Iraq. I published that in 2006. I wrote to the Australian Federal Police at the time and told them about the threats of Islamic extremists in Australia. And also the politicians, I wrote to them as well. It could have easily been prevented, and the book that I wrote covered lots of issues to do with September 11th, which by the way was done by the US government, and they used Muslims in that event to try to put the blame onto them. But in fact those buildings were demolished with high-tech explosives. However, the book I covered, in the book I covered issues to do with relationships with Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly the issue of terrorism in Western nations, looking at the United Kingdom, Spain, the terrorist attacks there, also in Asia, in Bali. So these terrorist attacks have been building up for particularly the last decade or 2, and recently in the United States, and now there's a hostage by Islamic extremists in Australia, which is all linked to it, pretty much because Islam promotes a very violent and dangerous political ideology, which is violent, and their violence against women and children is horrific. They displayed, the hostage taker displayed an Islamic flag in the window of the cafe in Sydney, and the description was something like, the only true God is Allah, and Muhammad is his only, the one true God is Allah and Muhammad is his only prophet, associated with a hostage taking, a violent event in which 3 people died, including the gunman, and the fault of that is with Australian politicians as well as the Muslim men involved. And if you look at the sheiks, the Muslim men, and those so-called clerics, they're basically satanic teachers. Islam is a satanic political ideology that always associated with violence and death. And the politicians are at fault. Liberal and Labor politicians are at fault for this hostage siege and any Islamic violence that will go on in Australia. This is not the end of it. This is just the beginning, because they don't listen. Those politicians don't listen. They don't have any morals, and they don't have any wisdom. And what they should have done years ago is deported them. They should have deported the male Muslim men who are extremists, who are known to the federal police to have extreme violent ideologies, and also the Muslim clerics, who are satanic teachers. I'm a teacher of the New Testament, a Christian teacher. I'm one of the greatest teachers of biblical eschatology in the world. Specialise in apocalyptic literature, New Testament teaching. I've written and published 4 books of non-fiction literature. I've got a Master of Education, 18 years teaching experience. I should have been interviewed about this because I wrote a book about Islamic terrorism and published it in 2006. And all the excuses that are given by the people out there, you've got nobody blame but yourselves when you side with and make excuses for Islam and Muslim men who promote violence and who want to destroy Western nations. The history, ideology, values and culture of Western nations that want to destroy Christians, they cut the heads off of Christians. They rape women and children and have sex with little children. Child marriage is widespread indoctrinated pedophilia. They cut off the clitorises of little girls. And in the Islamic literature, if you're not a Muslim, you're known as a kafir. They believe that we are... They teach in their literature, in Islamic literature, not to associate with non-Muslims and not to integrate with non-Muslims. And they refer to non-Muslims as kafirs. And we are to be destroyed. They will kill us. They kill Christians, atheists, Buddhists, Hindus. They need to be deported. The men need to be deported. Muslim men need to be deported back to the Middle East. Out of all Western nations, including Australia, including the United States, including Canada, including European nations, the men need to be pushed back to Middle East nations so they can practice their satanic, violent, dangerous political ideology, Islam. And they are never to be trusted. Muslim men are never to be trusted. They lie to the public all the time. And when the media interviews them, the sheikh of this and the sheikh of that, and this Islamic cleric, they are lying to the public repeatedly, lying to your face. But you're so gullible that you believe it. This is the fault of Muslim men and politicians, Australian politicians. 3 people are dead. Those 2 Australian citizens who died have been murdered, and those politicians should have deported all of the Muslim extremists, the men, and the Muslim clerics in Australia. They should have been deported years ago. They should have been deported years ago. That would have prevented it. That would have stopped it. This is easily preventable. It should have been prevented. But it's not going to stop here. It will continue. Because people like Tony Abbott and Bill Shorten and idiots like that, they have got no morals and no wisdom. They cannot discern correctly between good and evil, and they cannot make effective decisions accordingly. That's why Christian women need to be in the parliaments. If our parliaments, if Australian parliaments were full of Christian women, this would not have happened. This would not have happened because we have the wisdom and the intelligence and the morals to deport these extreme Muslim men and the clerics from Australia forever. And they need to be physically removed. Mosques need to be dismantled. The schools need to be closed, Islamic schools. The Quran in Australia needs to be destroyed. It's a satanic book full of violence and destruction of anybody who's not Islamic. And if you don't think that's true, you are naive. And you will be just as guilty for the death of these Australian people. Because you're naive, you're making excuses for them, and you're going to continue to allow them to be here to procreate. If you allow the men to stay with the women in Australia, they will procreate, increase in numbers, and the evidence shows throughout the Western world and in Islamic nations now throughout Asia and the Middle East and Africa, when they procreate, increase in numbers, they get more powerful and they get a lot bolder in their public rhetoric for Sharia law and for Islamic law to be ruled in that nation. And that's what's happening in countries like the United Kingdom, in Sweden. Sweden is in crisis. The women there are getting raped, little children. And they have said, Muslim men in Europe, when they take over Europe, they will rape all Western women and force them to cover up. And that's what they force women to wear oppressive clothing. Because it's slavery, violence, subjugation and oppression of women. And countries like the United Kingdom, Sweden, Norway, those countries are in crisis in terms of Islamic procreation and numbers and takeover, and in the United States as well. And if we can't learn from that, and we can't learn from the terrorist attacks in Europe, particularly, and in Asia, and now this, you'll never learn. You'll never learn. Next time, it'll be a bus. blown up by a suicide bomber. Next time it'll be a train blown up by a suicide bomber. There are a lot of Muslim men, foreign men working in Australia, which is again the fault of politicians. Foreign men working in the public transport system, on the buses, on the trains, and in the shopping centres, in security work. You think that this is going to stop. It's not going to stop. And corrupt politicians like Tony Abbott feed off this sort of thing. He's a monster. He is the sort of politician who delights in this because he comes along, this happens, he doesn't care about the Australian people. He's the sort of politician who profits and delights and gets reward out of this because here's a disaster resulting in the death of people. He comes along, makes himself out to be a big hero standing there, we have thoughts and prayers are for us, or we're just going to leave this to the New South Wales police, doing nothing. And then he brings all his security forces in everywhere, and looks like, it turns out looks like he's a big hero, isn't he? Because that's what these arrogant, corrupt politicians do, to glorify themselves and big note themselves, that they come along and say, well, we're going to make a solution to this. Australia is resilient. Australia is prepared. Those are the kinds of statements that Tony Abbott made. So he's going to let this go on and on. He's not going to do anything about deporting these people or cancelling their citizenship and having them deported, which should have been done years ago to prevent this. This easily could have been prevented. This is the fault of Liberal Labor politicians and Islamic men in Australia.